Modeling from Weighted Addition to Multiplicative Interaction Part 1, number 1726, July 23, 2026, Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation, Category, Biomathematics. Introduction. Recently, after developing my triggering sensitivity index for stroke risk TSI-Stroke model, which is based on a multiplicative arithmetic framework, I began thinking about mathematical models for predicting other major chronic conditions and certain mortality diseases, particularly cardiovascular disease (CVD) and chronic kidney disease (CKD). One of the first examples that came to mind was the well-known Framingham CVD risk score, which is fundamentally based on a weighted additive arithmetic model. My purpose is not to argue that the Framingham model is inaccurate or obsolete. On the contrary, it has made an enormous contribution to preventive cardiology and has served as one of the foundations of modern cardiovascular disease (CVD) risk assessment and heart health management for decades. Likewise, many biomedical models, whether theoretically perfect or not, have provided practical value in certain clinical applications. However, this does not diminish the need for medical science to continue advancing. Scientific progress depends on continuously re-examining, and when appropriate, even challenging certain existing models, strengthening their theoretical foundations, and developing new approaches when they better reflect biomedical and pathophysiological reality. In late 2010, I had already developed my own cardiovascular disease CVD risk model based on a weighted additive approach. Although it differed from the Framingham model, it was still fundamentally an additive model and served its intended purpose for approximately 3 to 4 years. As I continued collecting long-term physiological data, I began retrospectively applying the model to earlier periods around 1990 to 2000 for when I had 5 times severe cardiovascular events. Although my historical lifestyle and biomarkers dataset was not as complete as it is today, I repeatedly observed that the model tended to underestimate the severity of what actually occurred. Years later, I found that this observation was consistent with reports in the recent biomedical literature, indicating that some traditional risk models may underestimate risk in certain populations. Guided by my background in mathematics, physics, and engineering, I gradually questioned whether additive model could adequately represent the interactions within a complex biological system. My intuition was that the simultaneous effects of multiple physiological stressors are fundamentally interactive rather than independent in many physical systems. Such interactions are more naturally represented by multiplication and division than by simple addition and subtraction. As a result, I gradually moved away from my original weighted additive model. For several years, I essentially stopped using my earlier CVD and CKD risk models while searching for a more appropriate mathematical framework. Beginning around 2020, my attention shifted toward viscoelasticity and later viscoplasticity. Then, only a few days ago, I experienced an unexpected realization: the underlying mechanics of viscoplasticity are themselves fundamentally based on interacting multiplicative relationships. That insight connected my earlier engineering work with my more recent TSI framework and helped unify the mathematical foundation of my research. My interest lies at a more fundamental mathematical level. Specifically, I am interested in comparing to different modeling philosophies, the traditional weighted additive model and an interaction-based multiplicative model. The central question is not whether one model is right and the other is wrong. Rather, it is whether these two arithmetic frameworks represent biomedical systems in fundamentally different ways, and whether a multiplicative framework may better capture the complex interactions among multiple pathophysiological factors that drive the progression of chronic conditions and many mortality-related diseases. An additive weighted model assumes that each risk factor contributes independently and can simply be accumulated. However, biomedical systems are highly interactive. Risk factors continuously influence one another, so their combined effects may be multiplicative rather than merely additive. In this framework, topology serves as a geometric representation of the biomedical system rather than merely an abstract mathematical concept. To me, the evolving multidimensional geometry represents the cumulative results of stress-strain interactions between pathophysiological inputs and biomedical outputs. From an applied mathematics perspective, these geometric changes are not random. They emerge from the underlying multiplicative interactions among multiple and complex pathophysiological variables. Thus, topology provides a visual representation of how complex biomedical systems evolve under continuous, multifactorial, metabolic, and time-dependent influences. Therefore, my discussion focuses on mathematical model architecture rather than on criticizing any particular clinical model in medicine. Mathematical motivation. After completing my TSI-Stroke modeling early March of 2026, I began asking a broader mathematical question. Could certain chronic diseases be represented more realistically by an interaction-based, multiplicative framework instead of a weighted additive framework? This question naturally led me to examine one of the best-known cardiovascular prediction models, the Framingham Risk Score. The concept I am referring to are real-world clinical cardiovascular disease (CVD) cases showing higher observed risk than predicted by Framingham risk models. Underestimation is a widely documented topic in recent cardiology literature, rather than attempting to replace the Framingham model. I seek to understand whether a different mathematical architecture may better represent the complex interactions within human pathophysiology. Therefore, I have begun developing multiplication-based CVD and CKD risk models using the 4.5 million data points I have collected over the past 17 years. Evidence from the cardiology literature. Several landmark studies have investigated situations in which Framingham risk models underestimated observed cardiovascular risk. These studies provide useful examples for comparing weighted additive models with interaction-based mathematical frameworks. 1. Framingham underestimation in high-risk clinical populations. Study Framingham Risk Score underestimates the risk of cardiovascular events in the HER2-positive breast cancer population. Key finding. This study evaluated real-world cardio-oncology patients against predictions from the Framingham Risk Score (FRS). The standard FRS significantly underestimated the actual incidence of adverse cardiovascular events observed in clinical practice. Relevance of these work demonstrates how a static weighted scoring system may fail to capture disease-specific biological modifiers that substantially alter cardiovascular risk. 2. Population calibration and underestimation in diverse clinical cohorts to Framingham risk score for prediction of cardiovascular diseases, a population-based study from Southern Europe. Authors Marriott et al., Albacete cohort studies. Key finding. The investigators reported that the original Framingham algorithms, which rely primarily on weighted combinations of traditional variables such as age, blood pressure, cholesterol, smoking, and diabetes, frequently underestimated actual cardiovascular event rates in several non-US populations. Relevance of these findings illustrate that weighted additive models often require recalibration when biological, environmental, genetic, or lifestyle characteristics differ from those of the original derivation cohort. 3. Comparison of Framingham with revised weighted model study. 2018 ACC Guideline on the Management of Blood Cholesterol and Pooled Cohort Equations PC. Source Journal of the American College of Cardiology. JACA Circulation. Key finding guideline discusses the evolution from the original Framingham equations toward the pooled cohort equations. Although the revised models improve calibration, they also acknowledge that traditional weighted risk scores may underestimate cardiovascular risk in patients with important non-traditional risk factors, including chronic inflammation, coronary artery calcium, metabolic syndrome, chronic kidney disease, and other risk-enhancing conditions. Summary of the published evidence. Collectively, these published studies indicate that Framingham and similar weighted additive models may underestimate cardiovascular risk in selected clinical populations. The common reasons include incomplete representation of disease-specific modifiers, differences among populations, and complex biological interactions that are difficult to capture using traditional weighted additive scoring systems. These observations do not diminish the historical importance of the Framingham model. Instead, they motivate a broader mathematical question: can an interaction-based multiplicative framework better represent the coupled pathophysiological processes underlying chronic disease progression? Why can weighted additive models underestimate real clinical risk? Standard Framingham models assign weighted coefficients to conventional cardiovascular risk factors, including age, serum cholesterol, blood pressure, smoking, and diabetes. These weighted contributions are then accumulated to estimate an individual's overall cardiovascular risk. Although this approach has proven valuable in certain preventive cardiology, it has several inherent limitations when applied to complex biomedical systems. 1. And measured risk modifiers. Many clinically important variables are either absent or incompletely represented. including family history, chronic psychological stress, inflammatory biomarkers, coronary artery calcium score, autonomic dysfunction, sleep disorders, chronic kidney disease, lifestyle quality, physical activity, dietary patterns. Each of these factors may substantially influence cardiovascular risk beyond the variables included in traditional weighted scoring systems. 2. Biomedical systems are highly interactive. Human pathophysiology operates as a complex adaptive system rather than as a collection of independent variables. Elevated glucose can accelerate vascular injury. Hypertension increases mechanical stress on already damaged vessel walls. Inflammation accelerates endothelial dysfunction. Obesity worsens insulin resistance, which in turn aggravates hyperglycemia and hypertension. Each abnormality amplifies the effects of the others. Consequently, the combined pathophysiological burden is often greater than the arithmetic sum of its individual components. 3. Linear weighting cannot fully represent nonlinear disease progression. Weighted additive models assume that each variable contributes independently according to a fixed coefficient, although each influential factor is assigned a different weight to reflect its relative contribution. N. The final risk estimate is still obtained by adding these weighted components together. In other words, this approach's foundation is weaker. This additive framework assumes that the variables contribute largely independently. However, most, if not all, biomedical risk factors interact continuously with one another. As a result, an additive arithmetic operation may be less sensitive than, or in some situations less representative of, a multiplicative framework that explicitly reflects these biomedical interactions. Furthermore, biological deterioration frequently involves nonlinear amplification. As disease progresses, interactions among metabolic, mechanical, inflammatory, vascular, neural, and endocrine systems become increasingly coupled. Relatively small changes in several variables occurring simultaneously may produce disproportionately large increases in overall cardiovascular risk. 4. Disease progression represents dynamic interactions rather than static measurements. Most weighted scoring systems rely on measurements obtained at a single point in time. In contrast, chronic diseases evolve continuously over months, years, or decades through ongoing interactions among multiple pathophysiological systems. Repeated exposure to elevated glucose, elevated blood pressure, chronic inflammation, vascular remodeling, dyslipidemia, and aging produces cumulative biomedical damage that cannot always be adequately represented by a few isolated snapshot measurements. This is part 1.